Why does talking about that make you feel emotional?
Because I feel the caller was the person who murdered my mom, and I told her everything she wanted to know.
On the morning of December 12, 1985, Yvonne Menke was killed at her St. Croix Falls home as she left to go to work, shot 3 times by a .22 caliber gun. This is the 80-year-old woman now behind bars for first-degree murder. Mary Jo Bailey, the alleged killer of Yvonne Menke. Witnesses told detectives Mary Jo and Yvonne were involved in a love triangle with a man named Jack Owen, and that caused issues between the three.
Yvonne's daughter, Julie Connors, was 20 and lived with her mom there. She says her mom went down to warm up her car before leaving work and was shot in the stairwell. After hearing gunshots, Julie could see someone running away from this view from her window. Julie testified that she's been haunted with guilt since that day.
Warning: what you are about to watch is a true story. The following program contains content that some viewers may find disturbing.
At around 6:25 on the morning of December 12, 1985, a 45-year-old single mother named Yvonne Menke told her 20-year-old daughter Julie to wait inside. She was going down to warm up the car. There was something she wanted to tell her when she came back. Julie waited at the window the way she'd been asked. 3 gunshots later, her mother was dead in the stairwell, and the person almost everyone in Polk County would come to believe pulled the trigger was a romantic rival. A woman named Mary Jo Lunsman, locked in a love triangle with the same man Yvonne had just given an ultimatum the week before. Investigators had a boot print in the snow within hours. They had a name within a day. What they didn't have, for the next 38 years, was enough to charge anyone. Until a granddaughter who had never met Yvonne Menke, working from a jail 2,000 miles away in Texas, decided 36 years was long enough to wait. Before we go further, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. And if stories like this matter to you, subscribe so you don't miss the next one. In December 1985, Ronald Reagan was in his second term. Gorbachev had taken power in the Soviet Union that spring, and something in the Cold War was beginning, almost imperceptibly, to shift. None of that mattered very much in Polk County, Wisconsin, where winter had already arrived hard and fast. 20 degrees below zero that week, the kind of cold where nobody wants to walk out to their own mailbox, let alone stand outside waiting for someone. A town small enough that everyone assumed a murder here would be solved within weeks. It was the kind of place where someone always knows something, where rumors travel faster than investigations ever do. Yvonne Carol Menke worked at Centuria Commercial Laundry and raised 4 children largely on her own, living in an upstairs apartment with her youngest, Julie. She had finally done something that should have closed one difficult chapter cleanly. She'd given her boyfriend, Jack Owen, an ultimatum: choose her completely, or don't choose her at all. No more splitting his time training horses with the other woman in his life, Mary Jo Lunsman. Owen had been seeing both women for years, the 2 relationships breaking off and starting back up again so many times that everyone around them had simply learned to expect it. But Yvonne had stopped expecting it. She wanted him exclusively, romantically and otherwise, or not at all. At some point before she died, she even wrote down a description of Mary Jo's car in her own handwriting, the kind of small, private note a person makes when they've started watching someone watch them back. The morning of December 12th started early and dark, the way every December morning in St. Croix Falls did. Yvonne told Julie to wait. She went down the stairwell to start the car. The first crack came. Then 2 more, fast, identical. Julie went to the window. She couldn't find her mother in the lot below, only a stranger, walking, then breaking into a jug, wearing a gray 3/4 length coat and a dark stocking cap, under 6 feet tall. Julie ran downstairs. She found her mother in the stairwell, blood already spreading across the cold floor. She called the sheriff's department. When deputies arrived and began asking what she'd seen, Julie said the sentence that would follow this case for the next 38 years. I knew this was going to happen. The autopsy confirmed 3 gunshot wounds from a .22 caliber weapon, 1 to the side of the neck, 2 to the back of the head, fired in a way investigators would later conclude meant the shooter had stood above her on the stairs, stepped over her body, and fired the final rounds downward into the side of her skull. No struggle. No theft. Whoever did this hadn't come for money. What they'd left behind was a print in the snow. Snow holds evidence the way almost nothing else does. Better than carpet, better than mud, better than anything a person walks across in an ordinary life. Press a boot into snow packed hard enough by a Wisconsin December, and you don't just leave a shape. You leave the tread pattern molded into the rubber, the precise wear from however many thousand steps came before this one. Sometimes even a manufacturer's name pressed faintly into the heel. Officers in 1985 didn't have DNA yet. For one night, in that parking lot, they had something almost as exact. 2 prints near the building. The same tread again, a block away, walking, then running, then walking once more. As if whoever wore those boots had only been afraid for as long as it took to get out of sight. Near the heel of one print, a single word was still legible, pressed into the snow. Arctic. Investigators moved fast in those first hours, interviewing 19 people in the original sweep alone. A short list of names surfaced almost immediately, and one in particular kept returning. Mary Jo Lunsman, interviewed the very next day at the bank in Luck, Wisconsin, where she worked. She told them plainly she'd stopped seeing Owen 3 years earlier. She mentioned a .22 pistol, an old one from her ex-husband, and that she'd since given it to a friend to sell on her behalf. 5 days later, on December 17th, deputies drove out to that friend's cabin, asked to see the gun, and took possession of it. A 6-shot Smith & Wesson revolver, stored there since before hunting season had even started that November. Among the people who knew all 3 of them, one witness offered investigators a theory that needed no embellishment at all. Whoever killed Yvonne Menke, the witness said, did it to erase competition. The Wisconsin State Crime Laboratory tested Mary Jo's boots against the cast from the scene and came back with a finding that should have ended this case in 1985. The tread, the size, the wear pattern, all of it consistent. Her boots matched the print at a murder scene. And still, nothing happened. No weapon definitively tied to the killing. No confession. No witness who could put a face to the figure in the lot. A matching print, a recovered revolver of the right caliber, and a motive built on a love triangle wasn't enough, under the legal standards of 1985, to bring a charge that would survive a courtroom. Investigators wrote down what they had. From the very first week, they believed they already knew who had done this. They simply couldn't prove it. The file never closed completely, but it stopped moving. One man in particular carried it longer than almost anyone, Paul Lindholm, who would go on to serve as Polk County Sheriff and would still be talking about this case decades after he retired. Lindholm understood, better than most, exactly what that morning had required of whoever did it. One of Yvonne's other daughters, Becky Clover, grew up the same way, one of 4 siblings, suddenly missing a parent. Becky eventually had a daughter of her own, a girl named Stephanie Hathaway, born a couple of blocks from the building where her grandmother had died, into a family that had already learned to live around the shape of her absence. Stephanie Hathaway never met her grandmother. Not once. "I didn't get to meet my grandma," she would say later, and that's not fair. By 2021, Hathaway was 35, working as a jail floor corporal at the Brazos County Detention Center in Bryan, Texas, 2,000 miles from St. Croix Falls, watching a case that had been cold for 36 years simply sit there while everyone who remembered it best kept getting older. It had been 30-something years, she said, and we wanted answers. She decided, from a jail in Texas, that she would be the one to push. Somebody needed to push it, she said, and most of the family said they didn't have the ability. So I said I'll do it. She started calling St. Croix Falls, requesting records, asking questions nobody in law enforcement had been asked in over a decade. In 2021, I didn't want to wait anymore, she said. Most of the people involved in the case had passed away. Polk County investigators picked the file back up and made it a priority to find and re-interview everyone who had any knowledge of Owen, Bailey, and Menke. This time, people talked differently than they had in 1985 or 2009. One witness, looking back decades later, said she'd always figured Mary Jo was the kind of person who had the audacity to think she could kill someone. Another, from the original investigation, recalled that Owen himself had eventually admitted he couldn't fake it anymore. He'd wanted to be with Yvonne, not Mary Jo, and Mary Jo had kept calling him afterward, calls he often refused to even pick up. Investigators went back to Yvonne's son, who told them the strange, muffled phone calls. The same kind of call Julie had answered without thinking, had actually been happening for years, and in his opinion, even disguised. The voice had always sounded like Mary Jo. On September 21, 2022, investigators sat down with Bailey herself, now living in Arizona. They told her plainly that the Polk County District Attorney was likely to charge her. She said nothing at all. According to the criminal complaint, she simply sat at the table. In November 2023, Polk County filed first-degree murder charges. Bailey was arrested at her home in Apache Junction, Arizona, and held in Maricopa County awaiting extradition to the state she'd left decades earlier. By the time it was over, more than 22 witnesses had been interviewed across the full span of the investigation. From the original 19 in 1985 to the final round in 2023, 38 years apart, asked, in the end, almost exactly the same questions. The boots that had matched in 1985 were still in evidence. The print, Arctic, half a word pressed into snow that had melted away 38 winters before, was still on file, preserved the same way the case itself had been. Never solved, never quite let go. The trial opened May 20, 2024, in Balsam Lake. Polk County District Attorney Jeff Kemp laid out the triangle for the jury: Menke, Owen, Bailey. 3 lives circling each other for years before one of them ended in a stairwell. Be with her exclusively or not at all, Kemp said, describing the ultimatum, which meant no more Mary Jo, romantically or training horses together. Defense attorney Aaron Berger countered just as plainly. Unfortunately, there is no direct evidence as to who killed Yvonne Menke, he said. This case instead is built on rumor and innuendo. But the most important witness of the entire trial wasn't a detective or a forensic analyst. It was a woman who had once sat beside Bailey at a table, encouraging her to cooperate with police because she had no reason yet to suspect anything. For 8 days, more than 30 witnesses took the stand. A woman named Rose testified she'd seen Menke at Owen's home more than once over the years. The triangle wasn't rumor. It was something people had simply watched unfold. On May 30, 2024, the verdict came back. Guilty of first-degree intentional murder. In the gallery, there were audible gasps. Tears. Family from both sides sitting in the same room as the word landed. Mary Jo Bailey showed nothing. The same nothing she'd shown at that table in September 2022, when she was told she'd likely be charged. Afterward, she turned to a bailiff. She said she could retire now. Stop worrying about it. Sentencing took place July 2, 2024. Assistant Polk County Attorney Hollywood Webster told the court exactly what the state believed this had been. It wasn't a crime of passion where she lost control of her emotions, Webster said. She very intentionally, very methodically murdered Yvonne Menke. Bailey had never admitted guilt, never shown remorse. Other than her lack of denial, Webster said, Bailey has not admitted what she did. She has not taken accountability for her actions. She has shown no remorse. Julie Connors stood. Decades past the 20-year-old who'd waited at a window for a mother who never came back, she looked directly at Bailey. You waited in a dark stairwell to maliciously murder my mom, she said. She didn't stop there. You sentenced us to a life filled with pain, sadness, and hurt. The courtroom didn't make a sound. Judge Nordstrand said 1985 law gave him no discretion, a mandatory life term. Parole eligibility set at 20 years under the statute as it existed the year of the crime. If the law allowed him any choice, he said, he would have set that eligibility at 38 years instead. He didn't have that choice. But he made sure the room understood what he thought of what happened in that stairwell. "I think it needs to be said how brutal and how horrific this crime was," he said, "and cold-blooded." Mary Josephine Bailey, 81, was sentenced to life, parole eligibility in just over 19 years, credited for time already served. Outside the courthouse, the room that had carried this case for decades stood for a moment longer than usual. Investigator Vitalis had been in second grade when Menke was killed. His school went into lockdown that morning, and he never fully understood why until he was old enough to do something about it himself. Investigator Biller had been a second-year law student when it happened, with friends inside the department who'd worked the file for years after he left it for law school and eventually came back to it from the other side. And the man who had carried it longest of all wasn't even in that room anymore. Paul Lindholm had retired before the arrest finally came, but when it did, those who knew him said it gave him something close to vindication after decades of knowing, without being able to prove, that he'd had the right person all along. It was satisfying when Menke's family got to address Mary Jo, Vitalis said. She had to listen. She had to hear it. "This case has been a thorn in the department's fanny for years," Biller said. "I feel very good about it." And 2,000 miles away, in Texas, a woman who had never once met her own grandmother finally had what the rest of her family had waited 38 years to receive. Here is how this case actually came together, in order. A boot print preserved in a sulfur cast since 1985. A revolver pulled from a cabin 5 days after the murder, the right caliber. Never quite enough on its own. A motive that never disappeared from anyone's memory, even when proof did. 38 years carried, more than anyone else, by a sheriff who retired without ever getting to make the arrest himself. A granddaughter, 2,000 miles away, who decided distance and time weren't good enough reasons to stop asking. And finally, in 2021 and 2022, witnesses willing to say out loud what they'd only been willing to think for 36 years. Take away any one of those 6 things, and there is no verdict in May of 2024. Nobody was ever made to answer for those 38 years. Not the first investigators, who had 19 names and 1 strong suspicion, and nothing they could take to a jury. Not the file, which simply waited in a drawer while the woman it pointed to remarried, moved to Arizona, and grew old in the sun. Jack Owen, the man both women had loved, never had to answer for any of it either. He married someone else. He moved to Montana. He died there in October 2021, just months after Hathaway made her first phone call back to St. Croix Falls. Just as the case he'd spent decades at the center of was finally, quietly, beginning to move again. He never knew how it ended. This case leaves behind 2 things worth carrying forward. First, a boot print that matches is not the same thing as a case that's finished. In 1985, Bailey's boots were tested and found consistent with the print at the scene, and a revolver of the right caliber was even recovered from a friend's cabin days later. That still sat in an evidence room for 38 years because none of it, without witnesses willing to speak, was considered enough. If you have a loved one in a cold case where physical evidence already exists but no charges followed, ask the investigating agency directly why and what would need to change. That conversation can start with your county sheriff's office or your state's cold case unit. Second, distance and time don't disqualify you from being the person who pushes a case back open. Stephanie Hathaway never met her grandmother. She made her first calls from a jail in Texas, 2,000 miles from a stairwell in Wisconsin. If a case in your family has gone quiet because the people closest to it have grown old or passed away, you don't need permission to start asking again. Every sheriff's office keeps contact information for exactly this purpose, for the relative, however distant, who decides 36 years isn't long enough to stop waiting. If this story made you think, please press subscribe so you don't miss the next case. Thank you for watching until the very end. St. Croix Falls is still there. The river still divides Wisconsin from Minnesota the way it did in 1985. The stairwell is still there, the same stairs Yvonne Menke walked down on a cold December morning to warm up a car. The same stairs a jury would walk decades later, trying to understand what her last minute had felt like. She never got to finish what she wanted to tell her daughter. She never got to meet the granddaughter who would spend 2 years fighting for her from a jail 2,000 miles away. Yvonne Menke.